In January 1940, Medals of Honor were awarded to 4 Navy divers for their acts of heroism during the rescue and salvage operations following the sinking of the submarine Squalus off the coast of New Hampshire in May 1939. It is worth noting that these Medals of Honor were the last ones that our country awarded to living servicemen for heroic actions performed during peacetime, which is a true testament to the high esteem in which these men are still held. The events that led up to that stellar ceremony in Washington belong to a tale of heartbreaking loss, stoic endurance, remarkable courage, brilliant engineering, an extraordinary salvage operation, and like the phoenix rising, an amazing rebirth. It is the story of the greatest submarine rescue in history.
Tuesday, May 23, 1939, was just an ordinary day on the seacoast of New Hampshire. It was cool, the winds easterly, making an unsettled choppy sea in the gray North Atlantic with a cloud-filled sky. Captain Oliver Naquin was preparing and maneuvering the submarine Squalus for her 19th dive, about 6 miles southeast of the Isles of Shoals. If all went well with this dive, the ship would be ready for duty at sea. It was 7:30 a.m. At 8 a.m., Admiral Cyrus Cole was at his desk at the Portsmouth Naval Shipyard. As commandant of the shipyard, he had a busy day ahead of him. The shopkeepers in the seacoast were opening their doors for business. The children were headed to school. At the Colonial Theatre in Portsmouth, the movie Wuthering Heights would be playing that weekend. Also playing would be Down to the Sea at the Arcadia Theatre. When the Squalus was reported overdue at 10:30 a.m., Admiral Cole immediately sent the submarine Sculpin to the last reported site of the Squalus dive. By 12:30, a buoy with a telephone was spotted, and brief communication with the Squalus confirmed that the submarine was immobile on the ocean floor. News spread quickly. A Portsmouth submarine was in trouble, sunk off the coast. No one was aware at the time that things were about to change on the seacoast, and that the name Squalus would become a part of daily news for the next 4 months. The Portsmouth Herald headline on the evening of May 23rd reads, "Sub-trapped off local harbor, rescue boats rushed to aid the Squalus, 240 feet below the surface." Daily reports and updates by radio and newspaper would bring throngs of curious sightseers to the coast to watch. The Coast Guard station at North Beach in Hampton was besieged by interested spectators. Mrs. Pauline Whitney and her 5th grade class at Hampton Center School had the opportunity to view the rescue from the Coast Guard tower. Students from the junior high were taken by boat to the rescue of the tragedy by their principal, Edward Hazen. Donnie Walker of Hampton was 10 years old when the Squalus sank. He remembers his father Clarence and his mother Nellie gathering the family in the Studebaker after they'd milked the cows to head down to North Beach at night to watch the ships coming and going to the site. Carol Cole of Wallace Sands Beach in Rye says, quote, "I remember one occasion when my mother and I were opening the cottage for the season. They used to test the submarines out beyond the Isles of Shoals. and we saw the boats come out from the Navy Yard in the morning, and come the afternoon they were still there, and we wondered what was going on. Well, that was the day the submarine Squalus sank. We spent the rest of the summer watching the boats out there and what they were doing. Thus began an ordinary day, as people went about their normal ways until they heard of a submarine missing. Then it became a time to watch, wait, and pray for the men of the Squalus and their rescuers.
On May 23, 1939, the submarine Squalus was performing its 19th sea trial. She was commanded by 35-year-old Lieutenant Oliver F. Naquin, who graduated from the United States Naval Academy in 1925. Under his charge were 4 officers, 51 enlisted men, and 3 civilians. He was at the helm of one of the most advanced American submarines that was built at the Navy Yard in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. Construction of the Squalus began at the yard in October 1937. Over the course of 11 months, about 2 million work hours and more than $4 million in 1937 dollars were invested in her creation. She was the most expensive American submarine that had been built by the Navy up to that point in time. She was completed in September 1938 and launched in the same month with the temporary identity of S-11. She was commissioned in March 1939 as the SS-192. She and her sister ship, the Sculpin, were the newest members of the Saga class of fleet submarines, which had the speed, range, and endurance to operate as part of the Navy's battle fleet. They could dive deeper, stay down longer, and carry more offensive weaponry than their predecessors. And for submarines, their creature comforts were impressive. They were roomy, bright, air-conditioned, had cold food storage, and flush toilets. With perhaps a little bit of envy, veterans of the older subs tended to mock what they called the hotel accommodations of these new wonders. On that fateful day in May 1939, the Squalus was located off the New Hampshire coastline, approximately 5 miles southeast of the southern tip of the Isle of Shoals. The prior 18 trials had gone well, and it was expected that this one would too. The plan was to test the sub's ability to submerge at high speed, also known as a crash dive. Before diving, the commander checked the safety panel, also known as the Christmas tree, to determine the status of valves and other openings. Green meant closed, red meant open. Panel design would have been similar to this example. The check showed that all critical indicators were green, so the commander sounded the klaxon and ordered the crew to execute the crash dive maneuver. It was a little after 8:30 a.m. As the sub started leveling off at about 60 feet, a catastrophic event hit them. Due to a system malfunction, the main air induction valve was open and seawater came pouring through the induction pipes, one of which was nearly 3 feet in diameter. Both engine rooms started to fill with water. The commander tried to surface by blowing the ballast tanks, and for a moment, the sub's bow poked above the surface, but the weight of the water in the rear was too much, and the sub started descending, stern first, at about a 45-degree angle. With the rear compartments flooding, Commander Naquin ordered all watertight hatches to be closed. Electrician's mate, 3rd Class Lloyd Manus, was positioned at the hatch between the control room and flooded areas. He held the door open as long as possible, allowing 7 men to reach safety. Sadly, his best friend, who was to be married soon, was not one of them. With Herculean effort, he was able to finally close the heavy door despite the daunting angle and the tremendous pressure of the rising water. His amazing feat of strength saved the lives of the remaining crew. About the same time, Chief Electrician's mate, Lawrence Gaynor, noticed that the batteries were shorting out and an explosion was imminent. He descended into the forward battery compartment and, surrounded by arcing bolts of electricity, shut off the power just in time to avert disaster. These are 2 heroes whose actions gave the survivors a fighting chance. The Squalus descended to the bottom, resting 243 feet below the surface. 26 men had drowned in the rear compartments, but 33 remained alive in the forward areas. Now the survivors, huddled in the dark and cold, trying to conserve air, had time to contemplate their fate. No submarine crew had ever been rescued beyond 60 feet, and they were more than 4 times that depth. Once the Squalus had settled on the ocean bottom, Commander Naquin went into action. He had blankets and other supplies distributed to the crew and instructed them to lie still to conserve air. He figured that at best they had 48 hours of air remaining. He then ordered the launch of a red smoke distress rocket, hoping to get the attention of any nearby ships. Next, he ordered the release of a yellow telephone buoy to mark their location. Now they could only wait and hope to be found. Meanwhile, at the Portsmouth Navy Yard, Admiral Cole was concerned when he found out that the Squalus was overdue in reporting that it had surfaced. He immediately ordered the submarine Sculpin to start searching for her sister ship. Next, he made calls to Connecticut and to the Washington, D.C. Navy Yard to organize a rescue operation. As a result of his call, the Falcon, an old minesweeper that had been converted to a rescue and salvage ship, would depart from New London, Connecticut, pass through the Cape Cod Canal, and make its way to the rescue site. On board the Falcon was a new technological innovation called the McCann Rescue Chamber, also known as the diving bell. This device had been jointly developed and tested by 2 Navy officers, Alan McCann and Charles Mumson, but it had never been used in a real-life situation. It was about 8 feet wide and 10 feet tall and could go to a depth of at least 300 feet. Reeled inside the chamber was a 400-foot downhaul cable that a diver would attach to a submarine's access hatch prior to the chamber's descent. On the top was an eyelet used to connect an uphaul cable. At the bottom was a rubber gasket used to ensure an airtight seal over a hatch. The chamber could accommodate 2 operators and 7 to 9 rescued men. As news of the rescue attempt spread, a large number of reporters would gather in Portsmouth and start to broadcast the upcoming events to millions around the world. In Washington, Mumson would take a quick flight to Portsmouth. McCann and Mumson's experimental diving group would take 2 other flights but would be forced to land in Newport, Rhode Island due to fog. So they jumped into 3 cars which frantically rushed them to Portsmouth, driving so fast that they outran their police escort. When they arrived, one diver told reporters, "After that trip, the terrors of deep-sea diving are nothing." Out at sea, the Sculpin reached the last known location of the Squalus, but due to a coordinate error, it would be 5 miles off target. Fortunately, Commander Naquin had decided to send up 5 more red smoke rockets, and by chance, a lookout on the Sculpin happened to spot the very last rocket. The Sculpin was then able to locate the yellow telephone buoy and briefly talk to Commander Naquin before the telephone cable snapped. The race was now on to pinpoint the exact position of the Squalus on the ocean floor. 2 tugboats, the Wandank and Pennacook, arrived on the scene to drag the ocean bottom, hoping to snag anything on the Squalus. Luckily, the Pennacook, using a borrowed anchor from the Sculpin, hooked onto something. When the Falcon arrived, Mumson readied the diving team. The standard diving suit at that time was the Mark V model, which weighed about 200 pounds and used a compressed air breathing system. A wooden diving platform was temporarily used on the ocean surface to help the diver prepare for the descent. The first diver sent down to investigate what the Pennacook had actually snagged was Martin Sabisky. At 6'4", he was the tallest of the Navy divers and looked monstrous in the diving suit. Even performing simple tasks at over 240 feet below the surface was extraordinarily difficult, and he would be called upon to do much more. He would later be awarded the Navy Cross for his deeds today. Guiding himself by the Pennacook's hooked rope, he reached the deck of the Squalus and discovered that the anchor had miraculously caught on the railing near the forward access hatch. Shortly after, the Falcon crew lowered the rescue chamber's downhaul cable to him, and he was eventually able to secure it to the hatch after overcoming a number of issues. As he was walking on the deck, some of the Squalus crew began banging the hull with hammers to signal their presence. He then returned to the surface. Now time was of the essence. 33 of the Squalus crew had been on the ocean floor for over 25 hours in a steadily deteriorating environment. On the Falcon, the rescue chamber was lowered and started its descent. On board were 2 operators, John Milhowski and Walter Harmon, along with extra blankets, flashlights, a pot of hot coffee, 5 gallons of pea soup, and cans of carbon dioxide absorbent. When the chamber reached the deck of the Squalus, it was secured over the forward access hatch. After opening that hatch and an inner one, Milhowski stared into the jubilant faces of some of the crew and greeted them. After seeing the coffee and soup, one of the crew joked with him by complaining that there were no napkins included. For the first trip up, Naquin picked the 7 men who were in the poorest condition. The chamber then slowly made its way to the surface, where the Falcon crew was waiting for the survivors. The rescue chamber's round trip took about 2 hours. At this point, McCann and one of the operators agreed that more than 7 men could be taken, so on the next 2 trips, 9 men were brought up each time without incident. 25 survivors were now safely on the Falcon. Unfortunately, the 4th trip did not go so smoothly. With the last 8 men aboard, including Commander Naquin, the chamber ran into some technical difficulties and got stuck about 60 feet above the Squalus with a jammed cable. With advice from McCann, they were able to descend to 210 feet, but due to slack in the cable, they were suspended off the side of the Squalus. The only solution now available was to send a diver down to either unlatch or cut the troublesome cable. Walter Squire was chosen to do this very dangerous job. So with wire cutters handy, he made the descent in about 3 minutes and landed on the deck of the Squalus. He then determined that the cable, highlighted in white here, had to be cut, which caused the rescue chamber to swing freely like a pendulum and collide with the Squalus. Not surprisingly, the occupants of the chamber became a bit concerned, and to lighten the mood, one of the operators, James MacDonald, reminded them that being in a rescue chamber that collides with a submarine at over 200 feet below the surface will be a great tale to tell. At this point, some of the crew on the Falcon noticed that the uphaul cable was fraying badly. Alarmed, McCann ordered the crew to quickly lower the rescue chamber to the ocean floor to lessen the strain on the damaged cable. Walter Squire was brought to the surface, and it was decided that another diver would be sent down to attach a new uphaul cable, but his lines became entangled with the rescue chamber's air and electrical cables, and he was able to free himself, but he had to come up due to exhaustion. Then a third diver was sent down, but he ran into the same situation and had to return also. Ultimately, McCann decided that the only solution was to have the Falcon crew bring the chamber up by very carefully pulling on the frayed cable by hand, while the operators in the chamber constantly adjusted the buoyancy to lighten the stress on the cable. This technique succeeded, but not without great difficulties. Naquin and the other 7 survivors were finally aboard the Falcon. The rescue chamber would make a final, very risky 5th dive with the purpose of opening the rear hatch to determine if any of the crew possibly survived in the flooded compartments. This was a dangerous operation because the rescue chamber could potentially be flooded or filled with poisonous gas when the hatch was opened. Seawater did rush into the chamber, but it was stopped just in the nick of time. No survivors were found. Throughout the day, family and friends, as well as a throng of photographers and newsmen, would greet each group of survivors that returned to Portsmouth at staggered intervals. The emotional reunions would be broadcast around the world. Commander Naquin would arrive with the last group and insist that his men go ashore before him. 33 men had been saved in what to this day is still the greatest submarine rescue in history. A few days later, on May 30th, Memorial Day, 2 Navy ships, the Brooklyn and Sims, would do a 21-gun salute above the Squalus to honor the 26 men lost. Other ceremonies would also be held that day. Later on, a number of the survivors would get together for group photos. Here, Commander Naquin shows off a silver sailboat that his crew had given him in gratitude for his diligence in preserving their morale and hope during the long ordeal.
The submarine Squalus had been at the bottom of the ocean for a day. The Falcon with McCann diving bell and divers had arrived at the site. Rescue would soon begin. Anxiously, everyone who had gathered at the Portsmouth Navy Yard, mothers, fathers, wives, girlfriends, waited to hear any news that would ease their agony of not knowing about the fate of their loved ones. On the second day, news was transmitted to the Navy Yard and released to the media with the names of the men who were rescued and survived, and those who were missing and presumed lost. Evelyn Powell was first to hear that her husband Carlton was safe. She became hysterical, laughing and crying at the same time as a sympathetic neighbor calmed her. There was good news at William Isaac's parents' home in Washington, D.C., but the stress of waiting to hear that William had survived brought his father to collapse. Ellen Chestnut of Groton, Connecticut, fainted with grief as she heard that her husband John was presumed dead. She had walked ceaselessly about the Navy Yard with her baby daughter and 2 young sons, waiting to hear any news. In Dover, New Hampshire, 20-year-old Ruth de Sattel heard the news that first-class torpedo man Sherman Shirley of Little Rock, Arkansas, was one of the crew presumed dead. They were to be married on Memorial Day, but instead on that day, Ruth would lay a wreath on the ocean above the Squalus in memory of Sherman Shirley. The tabloids would call her the Bride of Death. It would be a trying day at the Navy Yard as word of survivors and deceased were broadcast on the radio and in the newspapers. The whole world felt the anguish and elation of the story that was unfolding about the submarine Squalus. There were 26 men who perished on the submarine Squalus. We honor these men, 24 crew and 2 civilians who gave their lives in the line of duty. On Sunday, July 30th, 1939, at 4 p.m., a memorial and benefit concert took place on the opera field at the estate of Mr. and Mrs. Arthur L. Hobson on Little Boar's Head, New Hampshire. Damp, foggy weather did not deter 2,000 attendees from enjoying the 2-hour program presented by the Boston Symphony Orchestra. Mrs. John Payne Wingate originated the idea for the memorial and benefit concert and acted as general chair for the event. The program was not only meant as a memorial to the Squalus, but also a benefit concert to raise funds for the immediate needs of the wives and children of the victims of the submarine disaster. The USS Squalus survivors graciously offered their services as ushers for the concert. 5,000 tickets were sold. A Squalus concert program was offered at the event for 25 cents. 100 programs were signed by Lieutenant Oliver F. Naquin, commanding officer of the USS Squalus, and were sold for $1 each. The memorial page and artistic cover design for the program were the inspirational work of Dr. Donald W. Leonard of Exeter. The committee in charge had hoped to have the United States Marine Band play at the concert, but due to lack of support from the Senate Naval Affairs Committee, they were unable to attend. Instead, 20 members of the Boston Symphony Orchestra, under the direction of conductor Arthur Fiedler, took to the field that day to perform works of Beethoven, Ionesco, Tchaikovsky, and Wagner. The audience was asked to join in singing the hymn, Eternal Father, Strong to Save, ending with the Star-Spangled Banner. At the conclusion of the program, the audience was asked to walk across to the shore where aviator Frothingham would cast a wreath on the waters over the Squalus from his airplane. Because of foggy conditions, this was unable to take place. On that concert day, the Squalus was still on the bottom of the ocean off the coast. The rescue of 33 crew had been a success, but the salvage operation, which had begun 2 months earlier, would take another month and a half of extensive work to bring the Squalus back to Portsmouth.
Now that all the Squalus survivors were safely ashore, the overriding question was what to do with the sunken submarine. The War Department decided that it would try to recoup its $4.3 million investment by raising, repairing, and refitting the Squalus, which made perfect sense considering she was the most technologically advanced American submarine of the time. A 4-stage plan was developed to accomplish this goal. The first stage would require the Squalus to be lifted and suspended about 80 feet above the ocean floor, with the use of large pontoons and by pumping air into her ballast tanks and other compartments to increase her buoyancy. She could not be raised to the surface in one lift because the sudden pressure changes would cause damage to hatches, valves, and ballast tanks. In the second stage, the sub would be towed and purposely grounded at about 160 feet below the surface. Divers could now prepare her for the next lift in better conditions. In the third stage, the sub would be lifted another 80 feet and then towed and grounded again, so divers could continue their work in a safer environment. In the final stage, the Squalus would be raised to the surface and towed into the Portsmouth Navy Yard, where the bodies of the deceased crewmen could be recovered, and the repair and refitting process could begin. In addition, the cause of the accident could be investigated. Admiral Cyrus Cole would be in command of the salvage operation, with Lieutenant Commander Charles Mompson overseeing the activities of the divers. Commander Alan McCann would also be on the site to provide assistance. The Falcon would play a key role by serving as a diving platform and providing other support services. The tugboats Wandank and Pennacook would also be on the site, along with many other support ships. On paper, the plan looked quite promising. One very optimistic estimate predicted the whole operation could be done in 3 weeks. But, as often happens, things do not always go according to plan. In the end, it would take a total of 6 lifts, done over the course of 113 days, utilizing 53 divers, doing 647 dives to complete it. The salvage operation would begin on May 26th. The first activities would require divers to rig the slings, heavy battleship chains, huge pontoons, cables, and air hoses that would be needed to lift the sub to the desired depth. With the stern of the sub buried in 18 feet of hard clay, this work would pose a daunting challenge. At a depth of over 240 feet, this was very dangerous and tedious work for the divers. Due to safety and other concerns, only one diver at a time could work at this great depth, and for the first time, they would use a new helium-oxygen-based breathing system designed by Charles Mompson, which was less likely to cause the mental confusion that often resulted from deep dives using the standard compressed air system. The only drawback to this new breathing system was that it would require the use of a much heavier helmet with the corresponding need for heavier boots, which increased the weight of the diving suit from 200 to 300 pounds. Also, they would now be able to better tolerate the frigid cold by using electrically heated underwear, which was another innovation developed by Charles Mommsen. Before anything could be done, however, divers would have to tunnel under the stern to allow for the placement of the lifting chains. With the use of the jury-rigged water jet lance, pictured here were Charles Mommsen, the divers, after days of work, were eventually able to clear a path for the placement of 3 chains to cradle the stern. Then 2 chains were set up to cradle the bow. Hoses were then set up that would be used to pump air into the Squalus's ballast tanks and other compartments. Next, 7 pontoons had to be strategically placed. 5 would sit above the stern and 2 above the bow. The topmost pontoons were called the control pontoons and would be used to regulate the rate and height of the submarine's ascent. These pontoons were massive in size, being 32 feet long and 12.5 feet wide and weighing 35 tons each. A pontoon of this size could lift about 80 tons when filled with pressurized air. On July 13th, the first lifting attempt began. The stern of the sub would be lifted first to avoid any center of gravity issues that might arise if both ends were lifted at the same time. The stern was successfully positioned at about 80 feet above the ocean bottom. The bow, however, became stuck in the mud as a result of the lifting of the stern, and it could not be budged loose even when the pontoons in one of the sub's main ballast tanks and the sub's fuel compartments were all blown. So to free it, the sub's second main ballast tank was blown and the bow began to rise. However, the ocean surface started to foam and bubble much more furiously than expected. Then, both bow pontoons popped to the surface. Something was not right. Apparently, the momentum from blowing the ballast tank had caused the bow to rise so fast that it had slipped out of the pontoon's harness and then headed straight for the surface. To the shock of all, the bow would be propelled 20 or more feet into the air, surrounded by a cauldron of raging froth looking much like a breaching whale, as seen in this iconic photo taken by the photographer Jimmy Jones for the Boston Post. Mommsen would describe the incident in this way, quote, "The bow came up like a mad tornado, out of control. Pontoons were smashed, hoses cut, and I might add, hearts were broken," unquote. The Squalus would then sink to the bottom, causing thousands of feet of meticulously placed air hoses, cables, and chains to end up in a tangled mess. Now, everything had to be redone to prepare for a second lift. On August 12th, a second lift was attempted using 10 pontoons arranged in a new pattern, and it successfully raised the sub about 80 feet above the ocean floor. The Wandank then towed the Squalus by the stern towards Portsmouth, with the Pennacook providing a maneuvering assistance. The Wandank also simultaneously towed the Falcon, which was positioned further back, acting as a restraining ship. The Squalus would be intentionally grounded at a depth of 172 feet, where divers could continue their work in less hazardous conditions. On August 13th, President Roosevelt visited the salvage site while aboard the heavy cruiser USS Tuscaloosa on the way to his vacation retreat in Maine. On August 17th, a third lift using 9 pontoons was made, which raised the sub until it was 92 feet below the surface. Then she was towed a second time and purposely grounded. Now, the divers could work much longer days at this new shallower depth. On August 28th, 2 unsuccessful attempts were made to raise the Squalus to the surface. Further attempts were delayed for about 2 weeks due to bad weather. Finally, on September 13th, the Squalus was raised to the surface using only 4 pontoons, 1 on each side of the bow at deck level with the same setup for the stern. It was hoped that it could be placed high enough to allow its surviving crew members to stand on the deck during its final tow into Portsmouth. But unfortunately, the height was too low for that to happen. The Wandang then towed the sub by the bow towards Portsmouth. On September 13th, the Squalus entered Portsmouth Harbor and was greeted by thousands of enthusiastic spectators and newsmen. There were a few tense moments in the harbor's channel when the sub was almost grounded a couple of times, but she would eventually make it safely to a temporary docking site, where she would be lifted by a crane to allow the water in her to drain. The Squalus would be officially dry docked on September 14th. In the early morning hours of September 15th, the grim task of recovering the bodies of the lost crewmen would begin. In a surprising development, only 25 bodies were found. It was determined that the body of the ship's cook was missing, and it was surmised that he had tried to escape through a rear hatch, got trapped, and then floated out during the salvage operation. His body was never recovered. Later, on that dreary rainy day, a solemn procession of hearses would exit the Navy Yard, carrying the remains of the 25 deceased crewmen. A large crowd of family and friends and other onlookers would gather to honor the men as they passed by. The caskets would later be loaded on trains to return the men to their final resting places. Soon the work to repair and overhaul the Squalus would begin. She would be recommissioned as the Sailfish on May 15, 1940. Even now, the recovery of the Squalus is considered to be one of the most remarkable salvage operations in naval history. And, amazingly, there were no casualties other than 2 cases of decompression sickness, which is a testament to the incredible skills of the divers and their support teams. Every diver who was involved in the rescue and salvage operation received an award. 4 Medals of Honor and 49 Navy Crosses were handed out. The salvaged Squalus would become a symbol of American technical ingenuity and operational expertise, but also a stark reminder of the sacrifices our military must endure even in peacetime. As mentioned before, the overhauled Squalus would be recommissioned as the Sailfish in May 1940. A small number of the Squalus survivors would serve on her. The first commander of the Sailfish, a tough disciplinarian named Lieutenant Commander Morton Mumma, was so adamant that his ship shed its legacy and be considered a new entry to the fleet that he would not tolerate his crew mentioning the name Squalus on board. With characteristic wry humor, crew members started using the name Sailfish, which unsurprisingly provoked the commander even more. As part of the Pacific Fleet in World War II, the Sailfish would sink 12 Japanese ships and damage 8 others for a total of about 84,000 tons. In a tragic twist of fate, the Sailfish would unwittingly sink a Japanese escort carrier named the Chuyo that was transporting 20 American prisoners who had belonged to the crew of the recently sunken submarine Sculpin, the Squalus' sister ship that was so instrumental in the successful outcome of the rescue operation. Only one of the prisoners would survive, and he was sent to a slave labor camp in Japan. When the Sailfish crew learned that information after the war, it indeed must have been very harsh news to receive. The Sailfish was retired and scrapped in 1948. However, the conning tower was preserved and can be seen today at the Portsmouth Navy Yard. Rear Admiral Oliver Francis Snakeman is buried in Section 5 of Arlington National Cemetery. His quote about the Squalus crew from the accident investigation is on his gravestone. Quote, "My officers and men acted instinctively and calmly. There were no expressions of fear and no complaints of the bitter cold. Never in my remaining life do I expect to witness so true an exemplification of comradeship and brotherly love. No fuller meaning could possibly be given the word shipmate than was reflected by their acts." End quote.